much for being on, and it's really wonderful to have so many people on camera. It definitely makes doing a virtual training a little bit more enjoyable when I get to see your faces. And Frank and I are going to be doing some activities and asking for some input throughout the session. So we would love, for those of you who are able to be on camera, we welcome you to be. If you're not able to be or it's not comfortable for you, that's also okay. But we are here today to talk about writing, pitching, and placing an effective op-ed. This is a workshop style training, so we're going to be doing a couple of exercises here and there. I know that all of you have hopefully put a little bit of time into thinking about a topic you might like to write on. Maybe it's something you're researching currently, maybe it's something you're advocating on, depending on kind of the position you hold at your university or in your organization. But we're also going to give you a minute if you haven't quite decided on your idea. We'll give you a moment to think on it in a little bit and to share with the group. But first, I know some of you know me and my colleague Frank, but I wanted to just take a moment to introduce ourselves and introduce Rethink Media in case this is the first time you have heard of us. But I am Mac Hamilton. I use she, her pronouns, and I direct the Peace and Security Collaborative here at Rethink Media. We basically exist to provide communications and media support and capacity building to groups in the peace and security sector, including the nuclear nonproliferation and arms control community. And we really find that it's often academics who are getting calls from journalists asking them to comment on various things. And so we want to make sure that if that's your role, you're feeling equipped to take some of those requests or to pitch yourself and pitch your ideas to opinions editors. So this is the first session that we're offering on this. We hope to stay in touch and be able to be helpful in other communications and media related areas in the future as well. And you see our emails here. Do feel free to be in touch. Frank, do you want to do an intro as well?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Frank. I'm the senior associate on the Peace and Security team. Specifically, I oversee our nuclear arms control and disarmament and China portfolio. And yeah, excited to meet you all.
Awesome. So I'll move us right into what to expect here. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, thanks, Mac. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to start with a quick intro into what op-eds are and why you should write one. And then we're going to discuss what should you do before you even start writing. And then we're going to go through the typical anatomy of an effective op-ed. And then we'll end with a quick discussion on how to pitch and land your op-ed. And we'll do a couple of exercises throughout this workshop, so please be ready to unmute and engage in the exercises. And again, at the end of this workshop, we will want to achieve these goals. So we want to understand what opinion editors are looking for in an op-ed. We want to identify the key components of a successful op-ed. We want to know how to write a killer thesis, an opening for your next op-ed, and then want to learn how to craft an effective pitch to land your op-ed. So here's our first exercise of today.
Sorry, Frank, I think I hit a button. Please
Oh,
continue.
was I muted? I wasn't muted, right?
Just for a quick second.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so sorry. So here's our first exercise. And if you haven't thought of one already, we're going to take a minute to think of a topic you'd like to write an op-ed on. And ideally, this will be a timely topic that relates to your current work or research that you are excited about getting out the door in the next weeks or months. So please take a moment to consider the issue you'd like to write an op-ed on and just drop in the chat box when you're ready.
Yeah, if you already have an idea, feel free to type that out and send it. We'll give everyone a minute or two to do that. Excellent. Preventing nuclear terrorism. Great topic. Oh, Libby, that's very cool. Nuclear narratives in the media. We see this a lot when we're doing our daily clips. I think some of you might get our daily
Yeah.
news clips. If you don't, we will follow up with the link to sign up for those. We do a daily digest of all of the nuclear news in US media every day for folks who do media facing work. And honestly, like the pop culture stuff reaches a totally different audience than some of the other work that we tend to do. Negotiating Iran's nuclear program, congressional partisanship, and American nuclear commitments. US-Korea talks. Wow, there's such an excellent range of issues coming up here. And Rika, yes, we will be talking a little bit about Rika. We have some examples in this presentation, so glad you're covering that, Unislawa. Great. Feel free to keep typing these in. We will definitely refer to them throughout the presentation. And yeah, can't wait to read some of these pieces. So I'm going to move us just into our intro to op-eds. So basically, I want to just start with thinking about what op-eds are. So what is opinion versus what is news? They're different things, and it makes sense that they live in different parts of a newspaper publication, whether it's a traditional, print newspaper or whether it's, a more recent digital type publication. These sections are always quite different and they have different editorial staff. That basically means that one part of the newspaper can talk about opinion. So an editorial board can do something like endorse a political candidate, or they can say, it's time for President Biden to sign the nuclear test ban treaty, or whatever the issue might be. That can happen in the opinions section, whereas a news reporter is going to be reporting in at least a more or less neutral way on what is the news that's happening. They're doing less interpretation of the news typically. And that's by design. So what lives in the opinion section? We're going to be really zooming in on op-eds in particular. But there's other things that live in the opinion section. Columnists do. So working with newspaper columnists who take a stance on various issues or analyze them is something that we often do at Rethink. Letters to the editor live there. If you think a news story has been covered in kind of a slanted or inappropriate way, you can respond with a letter to the editor. That's often a really impactful way to kind of change an opinion in a newspaper. Reviews of books, movies, films, etc., live in the opinion section. And then editorial board pieces as well. So truly anything that is stating an opinion is in this section. I want to talk a little bit about what opinion editors are looking for. So when we're trying to pitch a piece to an opinion editor, how are we wrapping our head around what might be appealing to them? So this is a piece that Frank and I worked on with Charles Oppenheimer, the grandson of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and Rachel Bronson, the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. So just to give a couple of ideas in terms of how to pitch and how to think about timeliness when it comes to opinion writing. Editors are often interested in a conflict, and conflict can mean a couple of different things. It can mean war or peace issues, but it really means, is there a controversy that's interesting that's happening? Maybe it's a controversy that's happening in Congress. It could be happening between two parties. It could be happening maybe within the scientific community. Maybe there's an interesting debate happening within the scientific community. But conflict and particularly conflict that is very relevant and hitting the news cycle is of interest. Impact, if you can show the impact of something that has just happened or explain an impact. So We reached out to a bunch of reporters, for example, around the Pantex fire that happened a few months ago, for example, as a climate-related nuclear issue. What would be the impact if the Pantex plant was hit by the wildfire that was happening in Texas? That could be a really interesting opinion piece if you were able to get that out pretty quickly. An anniversary can be interesting and something that you can actually plan for. So maybe it's the anniversary of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or on the first Russian nuclear test, or even the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you could talk about the nuclear implications. Anniversaries, you can always plan around them, and you can start your work in advance. So that's something that we often like to point to people in that direction, in case, some of our issues aren't in the news as much as we would like them to be. Celebrity, that's a little bit of what we did here when we were looking at Oppenheimer's lessons for nuclear threats. This came out right around the Academy Awards. I think it was the day after the Academy Awards this came out, and we were really intentionally planning this piece like for the month in advance of the awards, because we knew that we would have one big moment where the world's attention is back on Oppenheimer and back on nuclear weapons again. So celebrity is great. If you can kind of engage celebrities or engage with a celebrity moment in some way, that can be really helpful too. And then breaking news. This can be a little bit tricky, but sometimes you can have a piece or an idea in your back pocket and just be ready to really get it out as soon as breaking news hits. Like maybe you can anticipate that, on the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, maybe we're going to see some more Putin saber rattling, and maybe that's a good thing to prepare for in terms of breaking news, or a military exercise, that is going to take place, etc. So breaking news, you can't always plan for it. Sometimes you can, but that is always of interest to opinion editors. And then just to share in their own words, in the words of the Washington Post, what they're looking to help their audience understand. I'll just say that this is a little bit different for each publication because each publication has a slightly different audience, and they want their audience to learn different things by reading their opinions page. But I think this is a pretty good list of what most departments might be looking to help their audience do. So they want their audience to more deeply understand a topic that's coming up in the news often, help them understand what it means for them. And in nuclear weapons issues, that's something that we really need to think about. Why should the general public or the readers of the Washington Post or USA Today or the New York Times, why should they care about nuclear issues? Why should they not check out and, focus on celebrity and other things? Why does it matter? The Washington Post wants to equip their readers with arguments they can employ when talking about the subject, say at the dinner table, at Thanksgiving, etc. Maybe, their audience is already, kind of inclined to agree with our stances, and agree that we need to have more nuclear safeguards, but they don't necessarily know how to talk about it, and they're not equipped with the arguments that they might be able to make in their day-to-day lives. So that's something that we can do through op-ed writing. Elevate ideas that help their audience think about the world differently, expose them to topics they might not have heard about. That comes up often in the nuclear space, especially with some of the more nuanced pieces of nuclear safety issues, for example. Help them better articulate their own perspective, and be able to say why they would like nuclear weapons to be abolished, for example. Or to help them understand perspectives different from their own. So, we might say like the Wall Street Journal leans a little bit more conservative. They're typically not that open to, a nuclear abolition argument, but their editors might be interested in a nuanced take that helps their audience understand why the president shouldn't have sole authority from for example, from a national security perspective. So there's just some examples to think about as you're looking at what is the publication I'm looking to pitch, what is the audience, and what is the opinion editor? What's going to make them find my pitch interesting? And I'll pass it off to Frank here.
Thanks, Mac. And also, just by the way, I just want to mention that if anyone has any questions at any time, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and we'll make sure that we address them as we go through this workshop. Um, and so that's a great overview of what editors look for in an op-ed. But on your end, as the expert, why should you write an op-ed? What is the utility of writing an op-ed? We'll just cover four reasons today, which are credibility, diversity of voices, influence, and leverage. So first off, writing an op-ed can help you build your credibility as an expert in your field. And this is an opportunity for you to demonstrate your knowledge about the issue area that you study and contribute your voice to the larger discussion. It's immediate hit, it's in your word, it's in public, it's crafted however you want, like nobody's misquoting you, and this is attributable to you. And when we say, building credibility, it's not just about building credibility with reporters and with the public. Publishing an op-ed is also a great way for you to build credibility with your peers. And it could be an opportunity for you to elevate your expertise within your field. And another reason to write an op-ed is because you can help increase the diversity of voices in your space. So why does this matter? Well, we know that both our political leaders and the public at large are not always getting the information and the ideas that they need to make the best decisions. And when most of the voices quoted in the media about nuclear issues are from older white men, and I think, the most visual representation of this, if you look at a photo of the annual Stratcom Deterrence Symposium, we're missing vital perspectives in the policy conversation. An organization called Foreign Policy Interrupted did a study in 2016, and they found that in 2016, men are still writing about 85% of all opinion pieces about national security and foreign policy issues across various popular news outlets. And what is the cost to our society and to our policymaking when, so many of our best and brightest minds and best ideas are left out? But by contributing your voice and by writing op-eds, you can help change this. And thirdly, writing op-eds is also a way for you to create influence for yourself, for your organization, and for the policy proposals that you're advocating for. So here's just one example from The Hill, but this is common across, all kinds of outlets. You can see on the graphic on the right that in The Hill's most popular section, pretty much there's always at least one opinion articles, and sometimes there are multiple articles. And when you get eyeballs on your op-ed, you're actually reaching people and you're forcing them to think about your issue, and ultimately you're changing minds. And particularly if you get your op-ed published in a well-known high-level outlet, you have the potential to contribute your view to the policy conversation and actually make an impact on policy. And it's not just Frank and Mac from Rethink Media saying that you should write op-ed and op-ed change mind. This is backed up by empirical research as well. There were two large randomized experiments conducted in 2018 by academics that found that op-eds significantly, have significant effects on people's view among both the general public and policy experts. And lastly, you should write an op-ed because you can use it to leverage for even more media down the road. So what does that mean? We've talked about how publishing op-eds establish your credibility as an expert. The more and better op-eds you publish, the higher your profile becomes, which can in turn lead to more opportunities to engage with the media. On our end, for example, when we pitch experts that we work with to reporters to, be quoted in the reporters' articles, we always include the expert's previous media experience, including op-ed pieces they published. Not only will the journalists see your expertise, they can also through your prior media experience, they can see that you are very well versed in media. You can probably be relied upon to give a good quote, and in the future they can probably reach out to you, and you will be you'll be a very reliable expert. And just to share one example from the past, we worked with one of our partners to pitch an op-ed they wrote about the NPT. And after getting turned down by a few outlets, we got his piece published in The Nation. And as a result of this, uh, he was booked to go on the news program Democracy Now! To talk about this topic for an interview because the producer saw his op-ed in The Nation. And it just goes to show that editors, producers, reporters are always looking out for new, unique perspective and new voices, and that when you publish quality op-eds, that can be a great way to get you on their radar, get you noticed.
Awesome. Thank you, Frank. So now, right before we do our first exercise, I wanted to give you some ideas on what to do before you start writing. Oftentimes, we get a fully written piece from an expert saying, "Hey, I have this piece. Where do you think I should pitch it?" What is more effective for us as media professionals is if you already have the outlet in mind that you plan to write for. You understand, whose mind you're trying to change, why, and what publication is most effective in order to change that person or that group of people's minds. So this is why we have a little bit of a section on what to do before you start writing. So in this section, I'm going to talk about understanding and knowing your audience, the importance of being concise in opinion writing, how to make it personal as, kind of a tool for convincing folks, and then connecting your issue to a bigger picture. So first, a couple of things for before you start. You want to know what policy issue you're arguing for or against. You want to be able to identify who is your audience and what do they read. You want to have some idea of an ideal outlet for this to go in. It honestly could also be like, this could work in 3 different outlets, but you want to have some idea of the type of outlet you're interested in. You want to make sure that you know that outlet's guidelines and word count limits so that you're writing for that publication and to their guidelines and word limits. You want to know if they've recently published something on this topic. So this is really doing your research beforehand. Is there anything in their news section that is connected with what you're writing to? Have they published anything in the opinion section in general on nuclear weapons issues in the past, or even more specifically on the issue you're focused on in the past? Has it been a while? Was it yesterday, and therefore they might not be interested in another piece on the topic. But maybe if they published something 6 months ago, it's time for kind of a new angle or a new way to address that topic. So those are just a few things to ask yourself, and we will send along a worksheet so that you can have those ideas in your head before you start writing. But first, really knowing your audience. So you want to think a little bit about who you're trying to convince with your argument and what's your theory of change behind that. So, if you're trying to reach an audience that's a policy audience, Teen Vogue isn't going to be the right placement for that. CNN might be, The Hill might be, The Washington Post might be. Some of those beltway outlets would be the best way to make sure that policy staff of congressional offices or the executive branch, et cetera, might see your piece and might really bring it into their realm of thinking on these issues. It might be a defense publication specifically if you want military legislative staffers to be reading it. If you're trying to really change the public conversation on an issue or increase the public's understanding, then you might go for a publication like a Teen Vogue, or I know someone mentioned in the chat, I think Libby, that they're interested in video games and pop culture issues. You can look at a whole different set of publications to talk about those issues, and that can be a good on-ramp for a new audience to become engaged in these issues. So you also want to know, are you trying to rally the masses who already should agree with you? Say, we have some issues in the Democratic Party, for example. We're trying to convince moderate Democrats to shift a little bit on the Iran nuclear deal, for example. You want to know that going into your piece so that you understand, like, I'm trying to reach progressives and I can do that via publishing in the Nation, or I'm trying to convince moderate Democrats, and the best way to do that would be through somewhere like the Washington Post or the New York Times. Or a conservative audience, maybe it's the New York Post or the Wall Street Journal or a more right-leaning outlet. And if you're trying to convince a new audience, you'll think also about where they live online and what they're reading. I wanted to just show you an example of some submission guidelines here. This is Newsweek's page. They have a very concise guidelines here, but just to show you, they say, 600 to 1,000 words. They're looking for op-eds with a news peg that take a strong position on a larger debate Americans are having around the dinner table. And then they say how to submit your piece as well. Most publications have this publicly stated somewhere. If you can't find it, reach out to Frank and I, and we will give you our best guess. Some places have like very strict word limits. Some places don't give you one, but we can look at their previous pieces and make a best guess for you should keep this under 1,000 words, for example. 1,000 words is typically the upper limit, I will note. So that's not very much. Of course, those of you who write entire books on your subject or an issue paper, etc., like that is a teeny tiny amount of space. But that's really what they're looking for. And if you don't follow these guidelines, they actually are very unlikely to even look at your piece. So it's very, very important that you follow these to a T. They get so many emails and so many submissions that, like the job market, for example, they're looking for reasons to cut pieces rather than have an open inbox. And then finally, the last thing I'd say is that in 99.9% of cases, you should not submit it as an attachment. You should copy and paste your text right into the email. That's because, unfortunately, in this politicized environment, journalists and opinion editors are getting a lot of spyware, malware emails. They often won't even get an email that includes an attachment. It'll go straight to their spam filter. So make sure that you're putting the text right inside the email that you're sending. My next advice is just to be as concise as possible. So often we get an op-ed submitted to us for editing that has like 15 different points that contribute to their overarching argument. That is perfect if you're writing a journal article and you're conversing with your peers on an issue. It doesn't work as well for a 1,000-word piece. What you're looking for is trying to keep your argument as simple as possible and clearly supported by facts and reasoning that are very easy to follow, and that really starts where your audience is. That's why we say start with your audience and trying to understand who the readers of a publication are, because you can be a little bit more nuanced in the New York Times or in the Washington Post than you might be able to be in USA Today or Time Magazine. Their audiences are quite different. So you're going to write for those audiences in a little bit of a different way. And this is just especially true on very technical nuclear issues. You're not writing for your academic peers, and you're not writing for people who are steeped in nuclear issues day in and day out. You're writing for a publication's particular audience. So it's really helpful to take the time to think about who that audience is. And then making it personal. So why are you specifically the right person to make this argument at this time? Why are these people on this slide? So on the left, we have Alicia Garza, who's one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And then on the right-hand side, we have, of course, former President Barack Obama. The reason I give this example is, maybe both of these folks are writing a piece on Black female, maternal mortality rates at birth, for example. But Alicia Garza is going to be talking and writing about that issue from a very different perspective than former President Barack Obama would be. And all that to say, if I can't tell whether Alicia Garza or Barack Obama wrote a piece, then it's unlikely to get published. Even Barack Obama gets turned down by the New York Times for an opinion piece. So it's very, very important to make sure that you're bringing your expertise up front and, kind of explaining when relevant, what your background and policy experience is in order to make that sale, basically. And then finally, my last note before we send you into breakout rooms in a moment to do an activity is really connecting your argument and your piece to the big picture. So you want to broaden your argument at some point to illustrate the impact of your issue and that it's broader than just the specifics of the piece. So this is really the so what? Why should your audience really care about this, and why does it matter to them in their day-to-day lives? Why does it matter in terms of everything else that's going on in our world, and how does it fit in? So if you're talking about, the importance of passing the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, for example, maybe you're telling a personal story, but at some point you want to zoom out and say, this affects this many people around the world. This is important because, should we ever return to nuclear testing, we're going to put a whole other generation of people at risk. If you can do a zoom out and really tell them at the end of your piece why this matters, it's going to be a stronger pitch and a stronger piece. So we're going to do a breakout room in just a moment. Frank, I think, has already put a link in the chat, which should prompt you to make a copy of a Google Doc. This is our template OpEd Google Doc. We're also going to send this to you all via email. But we want you to look specifically at the top 3 pieces in this document. So what is the specific issue or policy that you're arguing for? That may be exactly what you put in the chat earlier. Who is your ideal audience? And what are between 1 and 3 outlets that you think would be a good home for this piece? So we'll have you start thinking on that. We're going to give you about 5 minutes to start on this. You can chat with your partners in your group. You might only have time to use 1 or 2 examples, but feel free to pick one and run with it. And then we'll bring you back in about 5 minutes and we'll share 1 or 2 examples before continuing. So give me just a moment and I'm going to assign some breakout rooms with 2 to 3 of you per room. Okay, thanks for bearing with me here. And I think that this is making sure that maybe Frank and I are not in a room. Give me just a moment. All right, I'm going to open those rooms now and put 5 minutes on the clock for you. All right. Is it just you and me, Frank?
Mm.
Cool. Feel free to pause the recording if you'd like.
Oh, okay.
All right. Welcome back, everyone. It sounds like no one came back early, so it sounds like you were probably having some good conversations and sharing some good ideas, and I'm very sorry to have cut you off. I'm sure you could have talked a lot more. But we'd love to maybe get one or two people to volunteer to share maybe one of the issues you talked about and the audience and outlets you considered. You can raise your hand or just unmute, or I might volunteer someone.
I think Chris is volunteering Ryan.
Yeah, Ryan, would you mind sharing?
Sure. I actually didn't get to finish what I was saying, so I guess this could be
Yeah.
a good way to do that. Um, so what I was thinking was 50 years ago, next year, there was the first ever study on nuclear weapon free zones, or these regional approaches to banning nuclear weapons, which was held at the UN. And so it looked at these regional approaches and all their dynamics, but a second study hasn't happened since then. And so I was thinking that to peg it to the anniversary, Mac, as you were talking about,
Mhm.
there could be a call for a second study that would look at, how to strengthen existing zones, how to help ensure better coordination between zones, to kind of learn the lessons of the past 50 years. And to look at this regional approach as kind of a bridge between global approaches and maybe more targeted bilateral approaches to nuclear arms control and nonproliferation. So I'd be tying it to an anniversary. I think for the audience, it's pretty wonky. You're trying to kind of convince governments that this is a good thing to do, especially in an international forum. So I would think it would be kind of a Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist or Arms Control Today, or maybe even foreignpolicy.com, something very kind of targeted in terms of the audience.
Awesome. That's such an interesting topic, Ryan. And I think you've named, as you were talking, I was thinking foreign policy or foreign affairs could be a really interesting placement for that. But also the bulletin would, I mean, they have an audience who would be really interested in this piece. So yeah, that sounds like an awesome piece, and we'd love to support your work there.
Thank
Um,
you.
Anyone else want to share their idea before we move to our next section? I might pick on someone I know if I don't hear from anyone. Okay. Libby, would you mind if I ask you to share?
Sure. Um, okay, so mine, as I briefly said in the chat earlier, is about nuclear narratives. And I specifically want to kind of compare what narrative is being given depending on what media it's through, whether that's Oppenheimer in the big box office or Fallout is now a TV show, but I think even that differs from what it is in the video game, as someone who plays video games. And so looking at those narratives and how they differ, and kind of the broad big idea that I had about this was, if you look back decades ago, you have things like fireside chats where they're over the radio and everybody kind of across a span of ages and diversity can tune in. Same with when The Day After premiered on TV, lots of people, that was their form of media that they intook. Nowadays, media is so diverse. If you put something on social media, you are very much being like, I'm targeting a younger audience. Sorry, there's background noise right now. If you put something on TV, your audience is going to be a little bit more mixed, but I would say viewership is down over the last couple of years. And so I just wanted to put something out there about the different narratives and who they're actually reaching when you put them out there. So.
That is such an interesting topic. Did you quite get to where you might like to publish, or you didn't quite get there yet?
No, I didn't quite get there yet because it kind of depends on, and I haven't fully like thought through exactly what audience I want this to reach, because I think it definitely harnesses a younger audience in the sense of like, I see what you're doing on social media and how that comes to be. But I think the main audience is kind of this older generation and how they're putting out their ideas in this space. I know NTI has done a little bit of, switching to more of a social media. FAS has been doing a good job about that. So I kind of haven't decided who I want my audience, my primary audience, I should say, to be, because that'll be where I want it to outlook. So.
Awesome. Well, as you keep thinking about it and playing with this idea, definitely consider us your allies, and we're happy to bounce ideas off of each other. We could definitely recommend a few like tech-focused outlets or even gamer-focused outlets, depending on the exact angle, but really interesting stuff. Jamie, please go ahead.
Yeah, so just on the outlets, this kind of came up in our discussion as well. We were wondering if you have advice on kind of, okay, we'd all love to publish in the New York Times and the Washington Post, what have you, but maybe that's not always feasible. That's like once in a million type of thing. So what's kind of the next, I don't want to say tier down, but what other type of outlets and specific ones could we be aiming for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think we'll go into a little bit more detail in the pitching section, but just to kick off, what I often like to recommend folks do is have like almost like your college application process. You have like your reach school and your safety school. So I typically recommend, or, if I'm working with someone on a piece, I say, why don't we try for the Washington Post? We'll give it a shot. We'll see, or the New York Times, whatever it might be. And then we'll say like, well, what about a USA Today? They have a really great readership. We know that it reaches a national audience, and we have a good relationship with their opinion editor. And we can help you pitch that. And then maybe like your safety is, maybe Inkstick Media would be really interested in your perspective, or maybe you already know the editor at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, John Mecklin, and you think John might take it. So that's typically the way that I go. We do have, I think, like a list of outlets that we could share with you so that you can start thinking about where might be good for your pieces. We can share that with you after the training. We'll send some resources via email, and we can include that. Rupal, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just had a question, having never done this before, but I've written for like the Monkey Cage and some other sort of short form blog posts. I'm just wondering to the extent to which editors or venues will try to edit or change the advocacy of a particular piece if it doesn't necessarily match what they've either published previously, or if it doesn't sort of go with the ethos of the organization. So I'm thinking here of like, if you're writing about something where typically the advocacy is it would be coming from like a liberal or a left-wing perspective, but you're trying to actually convince a right-wing audience. Do editors have any ability to edit what you write to change it? Like, I'm just sort of curious about that process.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do have a slide on this coming up, so I might just hold this for a minute. But in short, you will have dialogue between the opinion editor and yourself. They will suggest some edits. They should never change your argument for you. But they might say like, could you put in a line on this? Or I would recommend taking this out. There's always a little bit of back and forth. There's a slight danger that if you go back and forth too much, that they might say like, actually, I don't think this is the right fit. So there's like a little bit of nuance to be said there. But I'll get into that a little bit. And I'll take Chris's question, and then we want to move us along so we don't run out of time. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I had a question about pitching to multiple outlets, and how to go about that, the sequence of going about that.
I'm going to hold you because we have a whole section on pitching that we're going to get to. But in short, never pitch more than one outlet at a time, ever, 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 ever. If there is one thing you take away from this training, please have it be stick to the word limits under all costs and never pitch more than one outlet at a time. But Chris, I promise to go into more detail in that in just a couple of minutes. But for now, I'm going to pass it off to Frank for our next section.
Great, thanks, Mac. And Ruho, just really quick on your question, 2 points. Also, like if you pitch an outlet and in the end they really want to substantially change your piece, you can always just say, okay, forget about it. Like I'm not gonna let you like publish a different piece than what I wanted to write. And also to a point of like you kind of want to think about like, if it's up to me, I would have said this, but I'm trying to pitch to a different audience. So that's more of a framing question. So when you write your piece, you can just try to think about what arguments are more persuasive to them without changing the core tenets of your demand. So for example, right now we're publishing a piece in USA Today about Riga that is leaning very heavily on like military veterans, honoring veterans, and upholding our commitments to people who served and sacrificed for our country. That's very like heavy onto patriotism and stuff like that, because it's been co-authored by a Republican member of Congress and it's designed to appeal to Republicans in the House. But that might not be what an activist would write if it's just the activists publishing themselves, but because that's the angle we're taking, you can reframe your arguments. Okay, so next section, now that we've had an overview of what op-eds are, their utility, and some important considerations before we even start writing, now we're going to discuss what we like to call the anatomy of an op-ed. So in general, you should bear in mind that opinion editors are not looking for masterly creative writings when they look for op-eds. Most effective op-eds follow a very formulaic structure. It has an opening, it has a middle that is supporting arguments, and it has a conclusion. So you really don't have to, really stress over like, how do I make my piece really imaginative? What kind of flowery language I should use, etc., etc. Because again, like this is not creative writing, and it's very formulaic and it's very structured. So we'll take a look at each of these components and go over some successful examples. So an opening, your op-ed will always start off with an opening. This is where you introduce your reader to the topic and to your argument. And we cannot stress this enough, but your opening must contain your thesis, the main argument of your piece. And often if an editor cannot tell what the thesis is, what you're trying to get at in the first 100 to 150 words or so, they'll probably just ignore the rest of your piece and just reject it out of hand. They're not gonna read through the end to find out what you're trying to argue. And this is a key difference with academic writing, because oftentimes scholars would tend to give a lot of context, a lot of history up front, and then they gradually get to their point. But in op-eds, you have to start with the argument. So make sure that it's easier said than done, but make sure that when you are doing op-ed writing, try to have a different mindset than what you will have when you do academic writing. And remember that it's all about grabbing and keeping the attention of the reader who is not a fellow academic expert. And next, you should also make sure what angle you are taking in making an argument. So what is an angle? So for example, Mac and I could both argue that nuclear weapons are bad, but if she argues that they're bad because of their impact on the environment, and I argue that they're bad because they could literally get everybody killed, then we're arguing from different angles. And you also have to determine your hook. Opinion editors, especially those at high-level outlets, won't just publish a piece just because it's quote-unquote important, because they get a huge volume of submission from a lot of people every day. And a lot of them, you can make a good argument about, hey, this is an important issue that impact the rest of society. So why is your piece compelling now? Why is it relevant now? Why should people want to read it now? And that is what a hook is. So we talked about this a little bit before. Maybe there's a key anniversary. Maybe there's a lot of media coverage or public interest related to the topic you're writing on. You just need to figure out a good hook to tie your story to get the readers to get our readers interested in reading your piece. And also, it's just important to note that, while editors might have their own personal interest and view, and your piece might be of interest to them personally, if at the end of the day, it doesn't have a good hook and it cannot demonstrate why it's relevant or interesting to the readers, then it's probably not going to get published, even if the editor might be personally interested in it. And as Mac mentioned, one effective tactic here is just to take a quick look at the opinion page of the outlet you're trying to pitch to just get a sense of what they and their readers are interested in, what kind of articles they publish when you craft your own piece and think about, what should my hook be, what should my angle be. So here's an example, continuing from the Charles Oppenheimer op-ed that we worked on before. And here's an example of a strong opening from that piece. And in the first paragraph, you can immediately see the hook that the film Oppenheimer just won big at Oscars the night before and has been dominating our cultural conversation. So this makes clear that this is relevant to people who are not necessarily in the nuclear weapon issue space. And then you can see this, you can very clearly see the thesis that, all the cultural attention is all well and good, but we're overlooking the powerful lessons on arms racing that the film and J. Robert Oppenheimer himself have had for the world today. And what are those lessons? It continues to say that arms racing, then just as now, is both dangerous and futile, and that we must draw on J. Robert Oppenheimer's wisdom to not repeat the mistakes of the Cold War and to stop the new nuclear arms race now. And next, after the opening, the bulk of your op-ed will be made up of evidence to support your thesis. So this evidence could be trends, it could be history, it could be quotes, it could be personal experiences, it could be report or academic findings, or other forms of evidence. And your supporting arguments should also engage with potential critics. Acknowledging opposing arguments and refuting them will make your arguments a lot stronger. But be sure that don't spend the whole piece doing this. Like, you can do it just with one line or two, or maybe one short paragraph. Because again, like, your piece should be about advancing your point of view and making your argument, and not just negatively reacting to what others say. And then as the last note, make sure that as you make your argument, you sound like a real person. This might sound obvious, but it happens more often than you think when, experts who are very tied up in their fields, jargon, and academic language, when they write, they begin to sound more like a, very dense research paper than a person who is relatable and is making, and is making sense to an average reader. Because, at the end of the day, the piece is you sharing your perspective on something that you are very passionate about. So make sure that, your personal interest and your personal tie and connection comes through in your writing. And here again is an excerpt from...
I'm sorry, I'm having a technical issue, so I need to reshare the presentation. Sorry, y'all. It might have been a little confusing. I'm just going to try to fix the tech while Frank talks.
Oh, okay, gotcha. It's up now.
Yeah, I just can't get it to stop drawing, which is not ideal. I'm just gonna restart the PowerPoint. Sorry, y'all. All right. There we go. Sorry about that, Frank. I know he already mentioned these things, so I'm going to move to the next slide.
Yeah, so again, here's an excerpt from the Oppenheimer op-ed from the supporting argument. It's kind of nearing the end of the piece. And in the first paragraph, you can see that it drew on historical example as evidence. And the historical example was explained more in depth in the preceding paragraph, but it cited them again as evidence of later US-Soviet arms control later in the Cold War to validate its claim that Oppenheimer's understanding at the outset of the atomic age of the danger and futility of arms racing and the imperative of US-Soviet cooperation at the very beginning was correct. And that politicians like Truman, who ignored his warning, were wrong, and that today we cannot afford to repeat those politicians' mistakes again and go through another nuclear arms race. And finally, the last part of your piece should be your conclusion. And your conclusion is where you take a last opportunity to summarize or to restate your thesis, clearly lay out why this issue you're writing on matters, and as Max said, how does it relate to the bigger picture, and finally make clear any calls to action. It can be, calling people out. It could be just, very earnestly advising people to do something. Could be appealing to a politician. Could be appealing to a government body or anyone else, the general public. You want to take actions on this issue. And the conclusion needs to answer the classic question of, so what? Who cares? So, and again, here is the conclusion paragraphs of that Oppenheimer op-ed. It restated the thesis, and it issued a call to action. It called on political leaders to heed Oppenheimer's original warnings and reimagine global security today. And it spelled out the so what and the who cares question, which is, if you don't take those actions, all of us will relive the existential terror of the darkest day of the Cold War. And that obviously impacts all of us. So the last step you should take in your op-ed writing, which is often overlooked, but is arguably one of the most important steps, is editing. Once you finish your piece, you should read it through to make sure that your argument makes sense, it flows smoothly, make sure to check grammar, double check the outlet submission guidelines to make sure that you meet all of their requirements, including the word limit. Because again, like just to stress this, that if your piece exceeds the word limit so much that editors very likely just won't even read it, and then they will just reject it out of hand. And as Max said before, this shouldn't be the first time you look at the submission guideline. You should really be doing this before you even start writing, so that you have a specific outlet in mind and you can tailor to their need when you're writing. Otherwise, after you're finished writing, then you think about, oh, like who should I customize this to? That's a lot more difficult than when you just have that in mind before you even start writing. And it's also an opportunity to ask your peers, your colleagues to read through your piece, and just to, plug Rethink ourselves again. We are always very happy to help you edit as well. We have a lot of experiences editing and placing op-eds in the nuclear weapons field at high-level outlets, and we're always here to help and guide you through the process if you need any support. And you should always also keep in mind that when you're doing the editing, that opinion editors often will have edits of their own. And it's important that you stay open to their edits to produce the best possible outcome. But as we said, if you have concern about their edits, if you think, they change your meaning, make sure to communicate with that to them very clearly, but politely. And if the edits are very minor, if it's just about text, if it makes the language flow better, etc., and don't change anything substantial, then try not to be too stubborn about it, because you don't want to create a image or reputation of yourself as a very like difficult author to work with, because that will burn bridges with editors who if they move to a different outlet, they will carry that to wherever they go, and it's just not a great practice. But however, we talked about this. If they are trying to change your meaning, you should push back, and just and here's maybe I can share an example. Recently, we placed an article by the European Leadership Network in Political EU it's mainly talking about concerns with British and American nuclear doctrine that's increasingly, they think, that relies on using nuclear deterrence to deter non-nuclear threats. And when they pitched the piece, the editor reviewed it and said, okay, we're interested, but it seems like you guys are only focusing on the West, but what about, Russia is doing nuclear saber rattling, China is building up its arsenal. And what we advised them to do is that, like, the editor's point of view, we think that Political EU tend to be a bit hawkish in their opinion publishing. And they're trying to say that, like, this piece is not balanced because it's only talking about British and Americans. But the point of view of the author is that, like, we're concerned about British and American policy. We have influence over this. We're looking at this, and we're looking at the specific practice of relying on nuclear deterrence to deter non-nuclear threats, and we're the ones doing it. But, since the editor made this explicit request, they did add in, like, very small language to acknowledge that, there are other nuclear threats in the world as well, from Russia, and China is being not transparent about its buildup. So they convey concern, but they remained firm in saying that, hey, we're not changing the focus of this piece. We are still talking about British and American policy. And the editor was, able to accept that. So that's just an example, work with the editor, but be firm about, not letting them change the focus of your piece.
Awesome. Thank you, Frank. We were going to do another activity, but we're running a little short on time, and I think a lot of people had a lot of questions about pitching. So I'm going to go straight into our pitching section so we have some time for Q&A. But what we were going to do is have you kind of draft your opening and your thesis statement. You should use the document that we shared earlier and keep building that out for your topic. And do feel free to reach out to us if we can be helpful in helping you ideate around those areas. So to jump into the pitching section, we're going to talk about a few different things. I'm going to share with you a little bit about the components of a pitch and some best practices for length, for what to include, etc. I'm going to show you an example of a successful pitch. We're going to continue along with the example we've been sharing throughout this presentation, and I'll show you how we pitched that. We're going to talk a little bit about rejection. It is very common. It is the name of the game, and it's also an opportunity to take a look at your piece again and think about it in a new way. And then we're going to talk about what happens after you're published. So firstly, some of the components of a successful pitch. So as you can see on the side here, we've really just shown, like, this is what pops up in an email box if someone's just looking on their phone. You want to think about this because, editors get all sorts of emails all the time. And so you want to kind of like cut to the chase and make your email as easy to read as possible. I don't always use bullet points. You can use bullet points if you think it's right for the pitch and the piece, but just think about how your pitch looks visually to whoever is receiving it. So first, you want to have a very clear subject line. You want to do a very brief introduction to yourself, your expertise, who you are, why they should listen to you. And that could be really as simple as your name and your position at your organization or university. You should present your news hook, whether it's an anniversary, whether it's something that just came out in the news. I'll often link to a news story, ideally from the publication that you're pitching to, so they can see kind of how your piece fits in with the news section of their website, for example. It doesn't have to be from their news website, but it is a little bit more compelling if it is. You want to present your pitch or the argument that you'll be making. You want to confirm exclusivity. So this comes back to the question that Chris just asked recently about, can you pitch to multiple places? So it's very important to opinion editors that they have exclusive rights over your piece. And so that's the reason that we say, like, really never try to pitch more than one place at a time. even if you're short on time. You just really don't want to burn bridges with an editor. Say two publications, you've pitched both of them and they both want to take your piece, and then you have to turn one of them down. You're going to be in a really tough position the next time you're trying to pitch them on something. So I always say in my pitches, I would like to offer this piece exclusively to USA Today or Time or New York Times, et cetera, in my pitch specifically, because then they don't have to ask you, and they know that you're thoughtful about it. So I try to do that right in the pitch. And then I mentioned this earlier, but copying and pasting the entire piece into the body of the email, not as an attachment, is very, very important. So you don't hit those spam filters. So again, here's that example that Frank and I have been going through with the Charles Oppenheimer, Rachel Bronson piece. As you can see, this is a really short and sweet pitch. It worked. It got placed in time. So you can see all of the elements here. I put, a kind of a compelling topic. Oppenheimer's grandson is the celebrity here. So I've named him in the first words of the subject line of the pitch. I've mentioned the Oscars and kind of the timeliness of this piece. As you can see in the first paragraph, I've also specifically noted that the Academy Awards are rapidly approaching. I've linked to an article from Time that is focused on the film, and then I've noted the authors and why they should be published, why they're interesting to write on this. And then here I say exactly what they're arguing in the piece, so that that's understood by the opinion editor. And then finally, I just say it's offered exclusively to Time. You can find the text below. We're happy to work with you on edits. So we typically, as a rule of thumb, this is based off of data from Muckrack, which is what we use for our journalist database here at Rethink Media. Basically, we want to keep a pitch below 200 to 300 words. That's the self-reported preference by reporters and editors of how long is too long for a pitch. 300 is honestly a little bit long, so really just try to keep it as short and sweet as possible and let your piece speak for itself. Just a note on rejection. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, this is a thing that happens commonly. Your first choice outlet might not accept your piece. That is a bummer. It also, it might be that they have recently accepted a similar piece from a different author. It might be that they just have too much in the pipeline. Maybe they're short-staffed and they don't have time to read your piece. It might not be that your piece is written incorrectly or you're missing an element that we've shared in this presentation. But it is an opportunity to look at, kind of your second or third choice outlet. We talked about our safeties and think about, okay, how is this audience different from the first outlet that I tried? Do I need to make some shifts in my argument? Do I need to make my argument clearer? Is there something that I could do to make this more compelling for my second choice outlet? And again, we're always happy to help you brainstorm. Say you already tried one and you're looking for another. We're happy to advise you on where we think might be an interesting placement. But yes, it's an opportunity to just take a fresh look at your piece if you can. And then finally, what do you do after you've been published? So I know Frank gave some suggestions earlier when it comes to, kind of sharing out your piece. But we always say, like, sharing on social media is really good. It gets your piece out to your peers who you definitely want to see it and share it and engage with it. And then also reporters, theoretically. So I know a lot of folks are more reticent to use Twitter/X nowadays. It still is largely where reporters and the media are in terms of the social media landscape. It's commonly where they're finding sources. They might even quote a tweet or a Twitter thread of yours on a topic. So we'd really suggest posting it to your Twitter and your LinkedIn specifically, if not elsewhere. And yeah, making a thread with kind of your key arguments, because that might be retweeted, reporters might engage with it. You can also like share it to reporters who you might be looking to relationship build with. You want to disseminate it with your networks, so including on any professional listservs that you might be on. I know a number of us on this call are on like the Nuclear Advocacy listserv, or Plowshare's Basecamp platform. Those are good places to share with peers. And honestly, there are reporters on some of those listservs too. So it's a good way to get the word out. Any mentors who maybe you're looking to keep a fresh relationship with, you might want to let them know that you've published something, get their feedback on it. And then of course, I mentioned already, journalists, like maybe you've been in touch with a journalist, but they haven't quite called you for an interview yet. This is a good way to re-up yourself in their inbox, and just say, wanted to let you know I published on this, would love to get your thoughts. And maybe they'll respond, maybe they won't, but it keeps your name fresh in their mind and in their inbox in a helpful way. Adding the piece to your portfolio. So I know different organizations or universities may have, you know, a stronger or a weaker comms department, depending on just capacity and funding, et cetera. If it's possible to link to your piece on your staff page on the website, I would recommend reaching out to whoever in your comms department is in charge of that, so that you can have that as your most recent publication. That also helps you with your Google search results. We have a whole separate training on this, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but the more that you're linked with keywords, the more Google is going to push your name to the top of the search feature, which means that if a reporter is looking up your niche issue, whether or not it's associated with your name, it's more likely that you're going to pop up at the top of those search results, and they're going to find you more reliable as a source for that reason. So the more places that your name is showing up online with A, fresh, recently published content, and B, keywords that you know, are just associated with your area of expertise, the better. And op-eds are a really good way to do that. So are organizational blog posts, etc. This I already kind of mentioned. The portfolio and bio page can be kind of similar, but if you have a responsive comms team and they have a way to add this to your bio page, that's great. I know a lot of academics in particular also have personal websites. So if you have a personal website, you can update your personal website too, and that also helps you with those search results. And we're going to leave it there. We have about 10 minutes where we can do some Q&A. I imagine you all might have questions. You've had some excellent ones so far. We would first, before doing Q&A, like to invite you to just do a post-training survey for us. We do trainings like this pretty frequently. We want to assess ourselves so that we can do better in the future. And we just love to have your feedback. It also helps us report back to our wonderful funders like those at Carnegie, that hopefully we're doing the best work that we can do. So Frank's going to pop that in the chat. I see he already has. So feel free to raise your hand with any lingering questions on pitching, on writing, on prepping, or type your question into the box. But let's start with Jamie and then Ross.
Sorry to jump in again. So because op-eds are so short, is it common to write it and then pitch it versus some of the longer forms, you know, like War on the Rocks and things you typically are supposed to pitch before you write? Is that correct?
I would say there's a little bit of nuance to this, and the answer is kind of that it depends. Some of it, I think, depends on more the timing that you're working with. So maybe news just broke about something and you want to see if an opinion editor will hold space for you for your piece. Some outlets will just not really be very open to that, or the editor won't be like immediately responsive. But we will sometimes pre-pitch a piece, especially if it's very time sensitive. An anniversary is actually another good example where an editor might be able to save space for something. So it's not a bad idea to pre-pitch something, but more frequently we want to really finesse and like do all of the editing up front for a piece and then pitch it out. Because then they can just see the full piece, read it, see that hook, etc., and decide if they want to take it. But yeah, honestly, there's no right answer there. It's a little bit of an art versus a science. So either
Yeah.
can work.
I would also say that in our experience, it feels like if you're co-authoring, if like yourself is a very high profile figure, or if you're co-authoring with a high profile figure, it's more likely that they will be like an editor will be interested if you pre-pitch them and say, hey, here's who's writing, here's what we're writing about, are you interested? Versus if you're a new expert trying to establish your profile and there's not a lot they can reference, like what have you written? And then you just say that, hey, I have a concept, then that they might not be willing to just say, yeah, sure, write a piece and let me see. Yeah, Ross, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot. First of all, this has been super helpful. So thanks, Mac, Frank, for doing this. Mac, you talked earlier about kind of the analogy of like college admissions, right? So when you're pitching to have like your reaches and then where you think you might have a chance and then kind of your safeties. And I'm wondering how to get a sense of what the selectivity of different outlets are. Because certainly, I can imagine an outlet like the New York Times or the Washington Post, highly selective, right? I have much less of an understanding of where other outlets might be on that selectivity scale. And I'm just wondering how to even kind of get or understand that information.
That's a good question. I feel like a lot of this maybe lives in Frank and my brains a little bit. But for example, I know we showed like the submission guidelines for Newsweek earlier. They really churn out opinion pieces. They do a lot of publishing of opinion pieces. And so for me, they're kind of low-hanging fruit. Like they're more reliable, and they'll more reliably, at least in my experience, at least answer you. Sometimes like pitching can be like pitching into the abyss, right? Like the Nation never responds to me for some unknown reason. And so I have to figure out my workaround. Sometimes if you publish in Tom Dispatch, it'll make it into the Nation. Anyway, there's all sorts of like little minute things that differ publication by publication. But you're right in naming that, the New York Times, the Washington Post, like the Wall Street Journal, these like very top tier, highly regarded outlets, they are harder to get into. Often if I'm working with an author, especially if you're just kind of starting out doing this type of writing, I like to think of like almost like graduating to different levels. So maybe we start you with, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. We know that they have an audience that's really interested in these topics, and we know that they're a highly regarded name in the field. They're a publication that's known. And so if you can get published there, that might make it more compelling for you, for Newsweek to take your piece or USA Today to take your piece. We also didn't really talk very much about regional outlets, but it really does make sense to look at like what are the top outlets in your specific area, because just you being the resident of a state or a professor in a state or having some sort of a connection might make it compelling for like the Boston Globe to take your piece, or the Chicago Tribune. These are pieces that are places that have like huge circulation even beyond their regional area, and they're highly regarded. LA Times is another good example, Miami Herald. So really looking at those regional publications can also be more compelling, specifically if you have a connection. Maybe you were born in an area, maybe you don't live there anymore, but you can still make a connection there. There's different ways to finagle that. Hopefully that's a little bit helpful, but happy to answer questions about specific publications too. Sophia, go ahead.
Thanks, Mac, and thanks you both for this training today. This has been really helpful. You've mentioned a few times that you do this work of connecting authors with publications. So I just wanted to clarify, can we like reach out to you with pieces that we've written and ask for advice or help connecting with potential outlets for publication?
Yes, this is exactly why we've put our emails on the screen here. Please feel free to note them down. Email us. We're happy to be thought partners with you. Hop on a quick like 10-15 minute call if that's all you need. Or if you want some editing support or like you'd like us to ghostwrite a pitch for you that you can then tweak. We can do all of those sorts of things. So we are, funded by Carnegie to work with the nuclear community so that we as a collective can really impact the news cycle around these issues and change the way the public and policymakers think about them. So we really want to be actively supporting your work and working with you. I will say we are a tiny team, so sometimes we get a little bit backed up, and we'll just be upfront with you if we have a backlog. And the more time that you can give us, the better. Obviously, we'll try to be as responsive as possible if you're responding to breaking news, for example. But if you know an anniversary is coming up, I know we had an example shared earlier of like, we know it's the 50-year anniversary next year of this big event. The more you can put that on our radar in advance, the better help we can give to you. But do be in touch.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Any final thoughts or questions before we send you on your way to go forth and continue writing your pieces? It is okay if not, and you can follow up on email. Have I missed anything in the chat here? Nope, just a thank you. All right. Well, thank you all. It has been such a pleasure being with you today. I wish we were all in the same physical room, but it's nice to share virtual space with you. And, we're big fans of a lot of the research of yours that we've read in the past, and we're excited to help you get it out to a broader audience too. So thank you so much for all of your time, and I'm sure we'll be in touch.
Yep, thanks
Thank
everyone. Bye.